Welcome, everyone. Another audio in my series on the media. This is Grandmaster Dr. Thor Templar, and I'm going to explore today one of the major influences in the occult sciences, and to a certain extent racks up there with many very influential people out there, not because of what he's done, but because of kind of educating the public, and that is Art Bell, the famous radio talk show host from Coast to Coast is the name of his show. Coast to Coast AM, which was a very large radio station in Nevada in the middle of the desert, which he somehow, without going into lots of details of everything that started and his exact creation of everything, apparently he was an independent broadcaster who got hooked up with syndication and Coast to Coast AM, etc. Radio's a funny reality because there isn't much money in it unless you're a super success. I don't know how much or how many people are listening to radio much anymore. I guess it's kind of internet radio now. But this, he came on the air at a time when the internet was not that big. People were still listening to radio, and there is a large audience of people who listen to radios at that time, still. And radio, while always has been falling since the 1940s, is still a medium that a lot of people listen to who travel, who are up late at night in the many different nighttime jobs, and it is something that even is allowed at most jobs. So having a radio on is something that has always broken the nighttime silence. Now, Art Bell, as of the time of recording this, is, no spring chicken anymore. He's 70 years old and has an interesting background, but he's one of these lucky people who apparently had some metaphysical interest that he then started to talk about on his what was normally a political talk show in the middle of the night. I believe he did the typical graveyard shift radio, which again has a lot of audience from all those people who work at night and who are up at night, whether sick or just up or can't sleep, and all those people who work those nighttime jobs. I believe it was 12 a.m. to 5, 6 in the morning. He did 5 or 6 hours, I think it was 5 hours a night of talk, which is quite a bit to done. The only other person I know who's done that for many, many years was Larry King, who had a similar type talk show for many, many years and did 3, 4 hours a night, which is quite a bit of show to do every night, unless you have a very particular personality that you're able to do that. So, you got to fill those hours, and that's a lot of hours to fill. And there's all sorts of stuff on the internet now, and of course the internet has pretty much closed down all of that. But he was still at that very prime time, and it was at a time where it was very difficult to get information. And the Guild had been operating for some time, getting out this kind of information. Everything basically was in printed forms, and you had to go out and order little booklets or books and read about them, etc. And you had to order stuff, and it was difficult, and even the amount of written books were always difficult to find because most publishers didn't publish this alternative thing. So you had to order from other people who produced their own books. So, all that has changed, and whether this will be a big benefit in the future or not is still a great question. But there are particular times why people tend to skyrocket in their success, and like the 70s, the 1970s into the late 80s, and even from 1960s, the middle 60s to about in the middle 80s was a boom time for anything occult and psychic, and the amount of products and from games to books that were produced at that time in that particular area of interest is really mind-boggling. And when I go back and read things that are interesting or good, they always seem to end up in the 70s. It's quite interesting of when they were actually in serious work into ESP and so forth were done a lot in the middle 60s and late 60s, and then started to get a little diffused in the 70s and so forth. And so these were a big boom time, and that went through the 80s with the resurgence particularly of magic and witchcraft with Wicca and so forth. And of course, during these times, his show became very popular, and there are some estimates, which I saw recently, that he may have had 22 million listeners at one time. Now that's a lot, and even though, television didn't reflect that, there was, at the same time that he was on, there was a show called Sightings On, produced by Fonzie he was one of the producers, from Happy Days, Henry Winkler, who apparently has a metaphysical interest, and interesting enough, is a person with a lot of dyslexia, which I think is part of being connected into metaphysics. Is that dyslexics tend to be able to do magic better. So, but that show failed, and you have to wonder why. And there hasn't really been a resurgence of anything on TV in the metaphysical area, research whatsoever. There are no really general shows. There's been now in the last 5 years a kind of a glut of mini documentaries, which I'm assuming are very easy to produce and very cheap to produce, that are everywhere about UFOs and the numerous amounts of ghost shows. But, there's not much else out there. This was the time the X-Files were big when Art Bell was on. And so, there's a whole movement there, particularly for alternative science, for rebirth of extraterrestrial UFO information, and just in general, free energy and so many other things. So he was just there at the right time, at the right place, because we're looking at a man here who is extremely average. He has no God, no background whatsoever. And it's amazing how radio stations turn their airways over to people that have no background whatsoever in terms of, he's a radio guy. He's done a couple of shows before that, and here it is. I guess he can talk, he don't stutter, and he's able to somehow get on it. It's amazing how they do that. And, of course, we see with George Norrie, who ultimately replaced Art, that they'll put anybody up there. And in this day and age, they put people up there who are controlled and have hidden agendas that are working what apparently is allegedly for the Black Lodge. But here's a guy. Now, I have personal experience with Art. I was on his show many years ago, and I am uniquely able, as with everything I speak on, I'm not doing this by third-hand opinion or just from research. I've been in the trenches with all these things, from doing magic to alternative energies to extraterrestrials to everything else, and I have first-hand contact with that. Ghost hunting, etc. I've done all that. I know what's involved with it. I know what it's like sitting in a building which is falling down and decaying for hours upon hours and weeks upon weeks even, and know what the reality of those things are. Now, I've always been a nighttime person and up all night most of the time. So I've been from a young child, basically. I was always listening to talk radios, even in the 60s, when there were a few of these around the country where I lived. And I always enjoyed them. I wasn't listening to music. I preferred the talk shows, starting when I lived in Connecticut, to someone who, if you know of those areas way back then in the 60s, sweet Uncle Jay. There's a little inside comment for people that may be ancient. So the whole idea is that I'm familiar with the medium, and then, of course, when I lived most of my life in Los Angeles area. The people who started this of all was Bill Jenkins, who in the early and middle 70s had a show on. It's so long ago, I'm trying to remember, was it just Saturday nights, I think, or just Friday night? I'm not entirely sure if it was just one day a week or so, but he opened this entire thing. It was quite amazing, and as I said, being a talk radio junkie, or enjoyed that, listening to political discussions and so forth, and not into really music. And so I enjoyed the intellectual gnosis process of listening to all this information, all this opinion, and trying to figure out, what is the reality of it all. So the show was fascinating, and you're talking about at a time where I didn't even know what it was and really didn't even get into magical and radionics in general. But he was talking about radionics in the 70s and about these boxes and how I believe it healed he had some sort of broken leg or something that he healed with radionics. And he was the first one to publicize the use of quartz crystals, which became all the rage. Dale Walker, the crystal book, was the first person that I know of that ever wrote a book on it. It was on Bill Jenkins' show. And he was a very professional, studious man, obviously a radio commentator, but he was a serious person who was not just doing this for ratings. It was a sincere interest that he got involved in. I don't know his full history or what's happened to him or anything else. An interesting character. I may look him up for historical purposes, but you can't get his old shows. You can't listen to any of those things that I'm aware of. But it was quite a popular show for a long time, and from what I understand, he was recontacted again after that show ended. I don't know how long it ran for to do shows, but he didn't want to sell out. So unfortunately, this is the whole game that goes on, is that he didn't want to come back on, and I'm not really sure why, or maybe he was threatened or other things. I mean, there's all sorts of pressures that come on that you just don't know what's going on, and announcing them to the world doesn't necessarily help you. It just makes you be labeled as a paranoid. So the whole idea is that Art was not the first person to do this, and I don't know how many people around the country did it as well before him, but we certainly know of this person who was in the largest radio market that there was at that particular time, which was, and even today I believe, which is Southern California, Los Angeles area, of course, which is a very much of a car culture. So you have a huge radio listening audience because you're sitting in your cars literally for anywhere from 2 to 4 hours a day. And a mobile society, so there are people in their cars 24/7. I mean, you can get on a crowded freeway at 4 o'clock in the morning in Los Angeles is not unheard of. As a matter of fact, it's pretty common. So Bill Jenkins started all this stuff. I guess he was one of the pioneers to all this, and as I said, a very popular show, and certainly a fascinating one. It was so long ago that I don't quite remember anything, but I do remember that was my first, quote, metaphysical book that I ever bought was Dale Walker's Crystal Book, who I had up until recently. It wasn't anything profound, but damn, this was the first book on this mysterious thing called quartz crystals. And as I said, he talked about UFOs, and to talk about radionics in the 70s is pretty mind-boggling, considering what a tiny, tiny interest there was then. And as far as I knew, nobody knew anything about that. It wasn't until the explosion of occult radionics in the pretty much in the 90s, pretty much perpetrated by the Guild, that radionics itself got well known. Before that, it was a very small group of, quote, healing people, and I'm not sure who was involved with it, some agricultural, but nothing really became big until the Guild started mass marketing books and simple machines and so forth, and from there it caught on. But let's talk about Art Bell here. And of course, there seems to be some misinformation online. We don't really know. For a guy who has made such an impact, there's very little on him on Wikipedia or other sources of his personal and private life, but it sums it up enough. And as I say with all these things, we have to go by this. If something's wrong, he has a personal responsibility to change that, even though on one area here it says that he went to Harvard, which is some sort of joke, which he didn't go to any colleges, it appears, at all. But basically, he is a military brat. He was born in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, to his father was an officer in the Marine Corps. So you can figure, that's, Marines, military people are pretty goofy to begin with. The Marines are even more goofy. And not only was Daddy a captain in the military, his mother was a drill instructor, the worst type of Marine, the little psychos we all know about. So Mommy and Daddy were basically military captains, or she a drill instructor as I guess you'd call almost like sergeant type realm, and his father was an officer, a captain in the Marine Corps. So you're talking about coming from an extremely conservative reality and upbringing there on a military base. And what's interesting is that, of course, he's from a very young age, he was interested in radio. Apparently, at the age of 13, he was a licensed amateur operator from the FCC, and now he holds a very high extra class license from the FCC now, and has his own personal designation. So it shows that he was very interested in radio. Whatever that means, that doesn't necessarily mean you have any information whatsoever. It means that you can, about frequencies. I guess you have to know the Morse code. I don't know what all that is, but it has nothing to do with metaphysics or in any way alternative science. Radio is not exactly, what's the old cliche? Rocket science. So it really doesn't give you any credibility in this field whatsoever. It doesn't really give you any credibility as a radio commentator. I mean, most radio stations have engineers that do everything, and you sit there and talk just like actors don't know how to run cameras. They're not figuring out what the sound quality is. They're acting. That's what directors are for, producers and sound men and special effects. So, it doesn't mean anything, and certainly isn't assist to the fact that since you know how to turn buttons and get the signal that somebody is speaking into a microphone out to the public in any way makes you a credible person to do anything other than that. Most likely, with most things I found, techs are good techs, and they ain't good at nothing else. What's interesting is that he didn't join the Marine Corps. Apparently, it states online that Bell served as a U.S. Air Force medic during the Vietnam War. There doesn't seem to be any reference to much college, even though there seems to be some, but it doesn't say where he got any degrees or anything else from, but we'll talk about that in a minute because there's a little blurb on that. And it doesn't really matter if someone has a degree or not, but it's always nice to know, well, what is their training background? If you're a highly qualified researcher into the paranormal, most likely you've been like Penn and Teller. Penn Jillette went to clown college, and of course that gave him the training he needed to judge metaphysics. Apparently Bell did not go to clown college, so he's not a good expert. So let's keep that in mind. So it's interesting that he didn't join the Marine Corps, which is a kick-ass, dangerous place to be, particularly in the Vietnam War. He made sure that, because he was obviously a more intellectual type, was able to pass the Air Force exams, and that's what anybody with a brain did in the Vietnam conflict, as you went into the Air Force, because generally the Air Force didn't get shot at. And I don't know what he was as a medic in Vietnam with the Air Force. I don't know. I don't know if that meant he was in the bush helping people or not. Again, it is unknown. During that time in the military, apparently he worked in a pirate radio station in there at the Amarillo Air Force Base and played a lot of anti-war music, which pretty much everybody did there. So that's his background. So apparently he was not in favor of the Vietnam War, was not in favor of getting his life taken, even though he had very conservative viewpoints. And when I was on his radio station, which I'll go into, he apparently had certain... he brought things down to a very conservative attitude towards occultism, and of course had nothing to ask or do anything of importance. And it's very interesting of how I got on the show and everything else, and we'll get into that as well. But it says after leaving the service, he stayed in Asia, living on of all places Okinawa, where he worked as a disc jockey for the only non-military English-speaking station there. And of course, Okinawa is part of Japan. Apparently, while there, he got a Guinness World Record for staying on the air, 116 hours and 15 minutes. The money he raised from doing that stunt allowed him to charter a DC-8, fly to Vietnam, and rescue 130 Vietnamese orphans who, at the time of the fall of Vietnam, which were then taken and adopted by American families. So that's certainly an interesting, dramatic, and something to do. I mean, it's not really something that the average person would do. So, I mean, that certainly is a lot of kudos for that. It certainly is interesting that this would be something he would do. Could done like most people do, and they do nothing. Bell returned to the United States and studied engineering at the University of Maryland Park College. He dropped out, so he studied some engineering, which certainly is not metaphysical in nature. Dropped out and returned to... So he didn't get a degree, he dropped out, and then after working in cable TV and at a couple of radio stations in Nevada, offered Bell a 5-hour slot in the middle of the night. Okay, so it was 5 hours, and I believe it was midnight to 5 a.m. in the morning, because I remember doing the whole show there. And that program became syndicated in 1993. And few people don't understand that Art was on. I don't know how long he was on the airs, and I don't know about it. But he started out with a political talk show, and then on Friday nights, he wasn't on the weekends, he would do this, and I forget what it was originally called, but he would talk about these metaphysical areas, which apparently he found some interest in or was spurred on, or whatever the reason he did it. But he would start talking about this, and probably Friday nights were the lowest rating night. So nobody really cared, because people are busy on Friday night. They're doing other things. They're out on dates. They're doing whatever it is that people do on Friday nights, which generally isn't sitting in front of the radio, because it's transitioning into the weekend. So this was a good time to start this. And he used to do this every week for a period of time. And that was when I went on. It was not when he was full-time doing this every day of the week. It's when he did this occasionally. And I'm not sure what spurred, well, of course I was listening to his show anyway. I don't remember anything of his basic politics, probably because I didn't agree with them. And most likely being the little military, rah-rah American attitude that he has was fairly right-wing and uninterested and unfulfilling, which is interesting that he would get into all these virtually anti-government things. But he's one of those apparently libertarian types that are conservative in one way and liberal in others, which tend to be a large percentage of the population in general tend to think like that. So he used to do that, and you got to remember, you've got 5 hours a night to film. You may think that isn't that much, but, you know, when I have people who are in the apprentice program and the inner order and ask them to make an audio talking about something for 15 or 20 minutes, most people have a hard time talking for 15 or 20 minutes, particularly making any sense. Some people can't talk more than 3 minutes for whatever reason that may be. And it really doesn't matter if somebody's sitting in front of you. Don't you have anything to say? So filling 5 hours, just like Larry King can tell you, can be a big bitch. And you kind of grab people off the street. anybody who wants to be on your show, and there's not too many people that want to sit there for 5 hours a night and speak with you. So generally, you'll get people maybe to fill in a few hours, but there's not too many people that want to be up at 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning and talking to you on the air. So it's mano a mano, baby. It's you and the audience. So you grab anybody you can. And a lot of people don't think that they think it's difficult to get onto some radio shows. And it really isn't. They're looking for people all the time to fill these endless amounts of hours. And Art Bell has recently contacted me to go back on his show, which I doubt that I ever will, but I never say never. But it doesn't really serve any purpose for the Intergalactic Guild at this time. So, you are looking for people and looking for subjects. You're hunting every day to do things. And if you listen to a lot of these long shows, and I don't know if there's any 5-hour shows on the air any longer. Johnny Carson used to complain about how difficult it was to fill a 90-minute slot, and that every night, and that turned into an hour, which is now apparently easier, which is 40 minutes of taping time. In this day and age with commercials. Filling that time is always something that can be very challenging. And you're going to have to be a good speaker, and you're going to have to look for all sorts of stuff. Now, he has, as we just went over his resume here, we see that he has absolutely no metaphysical background or even interest. There's nothing here other than him stating that he is interested in radio and radio frequencies. I thought he stated he was in the Navy. Apparently he was in the Air Force, which is confusing unto itself. But the ultimate details doesn't matter. The point is that he came from a military background. He had some military experience, and none of this is metaphysically based. He hasn't said that when in Asia he had this, or he saw the horrors of the Vietnam War and had certain experiences, or talked to village elders. None of this is anywhere here, just like there's no even spiritual information here, even though he is a Christian and told me very distinctly on the air that, not believing in Jesus is pretty bad. So the whole idea is that's his background as well. So, but there's absolutely nothing here, nothing that I can see. He's written several books now as well, and none of them are overly on any particular subject. They seem to be I wonder if any of this really has come from him. They seem to me that they're more like so many other books that other people write them and you slap your name on it. That's part of the business. Joe Smith from Nebraska may write a fantastic book on a very interesting subject, but who cares? It's Joe Smith. If it's an interesting subject and it's by Art Bell, I want to read that. That's part of the business. I believe it's people like William Shatner, the Captain Kirky, has published all sorts of books, a whole bunch of them. 15, 20, and he's probably authored about 5 or 6 of those. The rest of it, he slapped his own name on there. And, to a certain extent, there's nothing wrong with that. That's the way you make money. If the stuff is of any value, particularly you're talking about mostly fiction stuff, what's wrong with that? That's all part of assisting, and everybody benefits from that. But, he wrote several books, The Coming Global Superstorm, The Quickening, The Art of Talk, and the Source Journey are the books he's written, and some of these were co-authored. His first book, or not his first book, but The Coming Global Superstorm, was written with Whitley Strieber. Again, I wonder how much input Bell had that and all, written in 1999. The Quickening, which is basically a book that gets into some metaphysical stuff. But again, none of this stuff shows a profound or deep thinking mind. And, everybody has their own style of how they are going to interview people and how this is going to be done. And, educated people go in depth. They talk about things. Uneducated people who are just, and Art Bell has always said, this is entertainment. He's not there to be in conflict. So you just let people talk no matter what they have to say, and you have nothing much to say after that. But how can you say anything? You don't have any background in that area. And Art Bell tried so hard to try and think of something he knew occult-based, and the only thing he could tell me is when I mentioned ELF frequency machines. He started to tell me what certain low-level frequencies in radio was. And I said, well, I don't know the exact frequencies, Art. I'm talking about just ELF ultra-low frequencies that seem to have effects. And he wanted to show how much he knew about radio, that this frequency, wasn't technically, and I'm not overly familiar what exact ELF frequencies even are today. I would look them up, but it doesn't have any value to me in general. So, here we go again with that kind of information that he has absolutely no knowledge on. So what you do in something like that is you try and, if the person is a talker, and they better be a talker, I don't believe I'm left much dead air, is that you let them talk, and of course you have a call-in show, and as long as you stimulate enough interest there, and as from what I recall, I didn't have any problems there. The problem I ran into on that show was the fact it came down to the you're a Damon Christian. It's amazing how people, carpet cleaning, ugly wife bearing Satanists who are criminals, get all sorts of publicity in all sorts of areas, and people buy their products. Yet, just by the fact of me taking I don't know if I was even anti, but trying to get people to work on other levels and not being a Christian spouting freak, I was attacked, and it came down to, it was an argue about Christianity, which really is not what when you don't have if you go on these shows, and I was quite young then, and you don't hawk a product, like he had Earth Change maps on there, I think by Tori or whoever the hell it was, and they go on there and hawk these maps, and I bet she sold a whole hell of a lot of those, probably thousands and thousands, and made a fortune off of it. But, if you don't go in there and hawk that, and you talk about occultism in general, and magic and so forth, and then you are... And it's amazing how conservative back then, when his show first started, of how out there I was. And for what I understand, he's had Satanists on there and everybody else, and all sorts of goofballs, and he hasn't read anything, and he's not really concerned. The whole idea is you put somebody on, you let them talk, you got to fill up 5 hours. That's how all radio works, people. There isn't experts out there. I even hear these financial advisors getting on the air, having these shows, and then, of course, the whores that they are, they're advertising the buying of gold, which is the worst possible thing you could ever do. Any precious metals, the worst investment you'll ever have. And I'm not going to go into that here now, but I will in another audio, because you can never, ever make a dime. But this is how it works. And another thing is, I had a friend who was so shocked that a positive review came out of a magazine editor that he knew, who was a nice guy and knew something, who reviewed a book and said how good it was, when the book was horrible, and the guy knew the book was horrible, but, well, you went through that magazine, there was a half-a-page ad for that book in there. Well... This book sucks. Go see the ad and read it. The author will be happy. Well, you can't do that. When I reviewed books, and I used to be on Llewellyn's review, they'd send you books if you had any kind of publication, because that's part of the business. Get as much free publicity as you can, and sending somebody a free book generally motivates them to look at it. You're getting all these free books in the mail, and then all you have to do is write a review, and this could be a few sentences or more than that. But if you write bad reviews, you're not going to get books anymore. What I used to do, if I didn't like a book, I just wouldn't review it. And I think to a certain extent that's a fair bargain. I'm not going to give it credence. I'm not going to whitewash it. And I tried to be as honest as possible. I pointed out the positives and negatives in a book if I felt it was worth reading. And most books, particularly back then, had some value in it. But, that's how the world is out there. So, that's how these people are. And radio in itself is a horrible place to do any publicity on. there's a million morning drive, psychotic, arrogant little pricks that want to get you on there and make a joke, have you on there for 2-3 minutes, and of course you got up at 4 o'clock in the morning, it's okay with you, and they make their show. Well, what's that funny thing you got there? You got some voodoo dolls hanging around there? Ha ha ha, squeak, 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 yeah, 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 and they're doing all these things, and you don't sell anything, and nobody on a drive show is writing down or taking information, particularly, again, pre-internet. If you could say, well, go look me up on the internet, maybe one of those people who are half asleep with a coffee in their hand or on the way home with a beer in their hand while driving may make note of something. But you generally, when you didn't have an internet, it was a complete and total waste of time and generated nothing. Got no business from it at all, and pretty much nobody did unless it was such a mass marketable product. A book you could find at your local bookstore when they had those. Remember those days, old guys? Bookstores, yeah. Maybe you would sell something, but again, it has to be something that is of value to the masses. When you're selling, you're just a funny little clown boy talking about interesting stuff for a couple of minutes, and they're off to the next thing. Where's my booze? Where's my porn? The usual stuff that drives human consciousness. So, you got 5 hours to fill, and at that particular time, I've been listening to art for a long time, being this nighttime person. This is even goes back before I was doing things full time, and still working some nighttime shifts, graveyard shifts. So I believe I just sent him or faxed him my one-sheet page on the International Guild. And lo and behold, I'm not sure I did anything else than that. Lo and behold, I get a phone call from him. Friday afternoon, the show is going to be that night. He wants me on that night. No talk about anything. Who are you? What you believe in? They want to do that on the air. He's got 5 years. If he has to dump you because you're a raving lunatic, nobody wants to talk to you, he'll say, "Thank you for being online, sir. I appreciate the time." Click. You're gone. So they don't care. So they're not going to pre-interview you. Now, with your average talk show on TV, what people don't understand, it's not a chat show, particularly in the recent years, and it never has been. You come on to a show like that and you're doing a bit. And it used to be when the time when it was really big with Johnny Carson, you went on there when you had a bit to do. It was an act. And certain celebrities used to do this all the time. Particularly Burt Reynolds and so forth. It was a bit, and it was a huge show that everybody talked about. Of course, those days are gone, but people have no idea the kind of show that was 20 years ago when he was really active, or maybe 30 years ago, whatever that is now. When you start getting up there, I think Jay Leno was on for 20 years or whatever it was. But before Leno, this was the place. This was the rat pack of reality for people, and it was a big, big thing. And even today, when you go on a talk show, you're doing a bit. It's just like you were a stand-up comic doing your routine. This is what you do, and they're planned out. Everything that is said there is planned, basically. You steer people. The questions are asked in advance. They come up with jokes and other things that are prearranged. So very little of it is unstructured, just like reality shows, scripted shows that pretend to be reality, but they're all scripted, from Dancing to the Stars to everything else out there. And if you watch Big Brother on CBS with their interviews and stuff, it's amazing how the common person acts pretty good, but you can see that this is actually written down for them and they're reading off of a monitor. That's what they do because people are boring. Just the way it is. People don't have much to say. And what they do have to say usually ain't worth hearing. They're not all as charming as me. So the whole idea is that that's how things work. So that's how it was. And I said, well, and I had to make arrangements. I just couldn't stay up all night that one night. And I'm not sure I was even waking up to do that. So I had to make arrangements. And I said, well, I can do it next week, Art. And so we rescheduled for next Friday, and I did the entire 5 hours without. He called me up. We're going to be on the air, sir, in 10 minutes. Hold on. And then you come back every 5 minutes. We'll be on the air soon. Stay online. And that was it. And I don't remember the whole thing, these that are round and about and up and down. But I remember it being an interesting experience, and he had a fantastic guest that could have talked about occultism, and he went on to hire witches to protect him. But, after doing that show and finding out kind of what a buffoon, ignorant person Art Bell was, and not in a negative fashion per se, they're all like that. It's not that there's anything special about him. I tried to contact his company and said, put me on the air. And, of course, that never happened. But I'm sure that got back to Art, and I was never contacted again, nor did I contact him. As I said, unless you go on there with the attitude that you're hawking something, and it's pretty hard to hawk occult products, particularly back then. But, I know how to do that probably more now, but, learn these things and so forth. But, it's not really what we're about, and I'm not really interested in having hundreds of people contact the guild. We're about training a select few that find us, and I don't really do publicity or go on any shows or anything else. I was recently asked to go on what seems to be a relatively failed show. Probably it's good I never did go on there, about UFO hunters that they got a group together of. But I'm not interested in doing any of that type of stuff, and it doesn't do any benefit. It gets you caught in a world where you have to compromise what you believe in, and where they're going to put on what is good entertainment, what is not necessarily reality. But I think it can be both. I think reality and what's really happening is goddamn good entertainment. And if you've got the quality people that can explain it that way, you've got one hell of a show. But I've done many different radio shows and those morning shows and so forth, which I would never, ever, ever, ever do again. And some of our people were on these shows as well. And it's not too difficult to get on shows, as I said. But you got to know what you're doing, how to say it if you're going to push a particular product. And, of course, now with the Internet, it's much, much easier. Go to my site. You can order it there. Well, that serves a good purpose if you're a business. The Guild is not a business, and we are a research and teaching organization. We're not really interested in publicity. But the plain and simple fact is that he doesn't have any metaphysical background. The books he's written have been sensational. They've been written with other people. One of his books, of course, is about radio and his experience there. I guess that would be interesting to read. And I may someday. I can't read and research everything. I have 150 books I'm working on right now. On top of doing everything else and writing all the instructions and stuff. I have enough work for 20 years if I live that long. So the whole idea is that, who is this person? And even bringing somebody in like Whitley, the Texan goofball freakhead Schreiber, doesn't mean that he knows anything, even about UFOs. He's had his own personal experience, but that may be one area. But to say that you have a background in everything, you'd have to be in a very eclectic organization such as the Guild to do that. I know everything about occultism because we've always done that. We put all the courses together in one place, the first people to do that, the first people to publish average authors, and the first people, to get all the traditions together so you could learn everything in one place. So I know all these things, and I'm not stuck in any one tradition. I like the tradition that works the best. And I've done this long enough to go through my likes and dislikes and find out what works the best. Now, apparently, and of course, he's had a lot of people on that are good entertainment, and they're complete nut jobs. And of course, Let's face it, people. You got 5 hours to fill. You better get some nuts that talk stuff that gain interest. Oh, that crazy man's on there. Oh, that's good. Oh, yeah, Hailbot Common. Oh, yeah, that sounds good. Ooh, Heaven Gate. Ooh, with the nut job governmental military psychotics that did the remote viewing. It just shows you how easy and powerful remote viewing is when you can get a military man to do it. Who can I kill and where can I hide? That's a military man for you. So, it's part and parcel to blame him for what anybody else says. The reason why he get blamed is because he was so neutral. And he didn't really confront anybody. He really didn't have any personal opinions. And he knew nothing about the subject matter or cared. I frankly doubt he was sitting at home every day reading all these books that these authors were hawking, so that he could talk intelligently on the subject matter. It's very difficult to be a professional researcher because it's a lot of work. And then you have to have interests in everything, not just, I'm an army guy. What knob do I turn here? That makes the antenna go up. Ooh, it's like my car. So the idea is that, it takes a very advanced thinker and someone who has a passion for the entire industry, not a fancy of what's going on. Of course, there was a lot of people doing things, and UFO people, particularly in Vegas, who are well known. But, he became to the point where this was a huge show. So going on there was very profitable to anybody that could go on there. And, in most radio, there's also a lot of people that pay to go on these shows. So you pay them because you're getting millions of people, and it's a great deal. So, they collect money not only from sponsors, but a lot of guests pay to go on shows. And, it depends if that's the case or not. Now, I don't know. I'm just letting you know. But, this is a big show. And if you've got, I think the better figure I've seen was probably around 12 million people. But if he had 20 million people listening to his show, this is PR heaven. And a particularly show where you can go on and spend time hawking your product because, talking about it, being on a show, well, that's a long time. That's an info commercial. And if you're getting on there for free because he just wants the big ratings, wow, you're making a lot of money. Can you imagine 20 million people listening about your books? If 1% of that bought books, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of them. In general, he seems to be, he quotes that he's a libertarian with a conservative attitude. As you said, he has pretty much your very typical attitude, I think, that most Americans have, immigration reform, decriminalizing marijuana, etc. These are all the things I think that every American believes in. Not particularly, like these right-wing Rush Limbaugh nut job out there, the drugged-out, freaked fanatic that he is, who wants to tell everybody about conservative values like most Republicans do when they're looking for bathroom sex and are as dirty as you can get, stealing every penny they can, with Jesus on their lips and a Bible in their hand and their other hand in your pocket. That doesn't seem to be. Don't let me confuse anybody. That's not Art Bell, apparently. He's had some very odd things happen in his life, which I believe are directly connected to getting this information, including a child that apparently was being molested by some teacher. Find that odd. I guess that may happen more than I am familiar with. Which I find interesting. Apparently, which, again, probably is not overly unusual, but he had one of his wives die from a serious asthma attack. People talk about asthma like it's not serious, but if you don't breathe, you die. And it's very serious. Some people never can breathe again, and if they don't get immediate care who are asthmatics, Apparently, this happened in Laughlin, Nevada, which is a gambling community on the border of California and Nevada. I don't think there's any hospitals there per se. I think it's about 20, 30 minutes to Vegas, where there are good hospitals. I'm assuming they had good emergency personnel there, but apparently they could not save his wife, which I believe was a psychotronic attack. Which I allege is psychotronic attack. I also allege that this teacher was planted there so that it would abuse his child to affect him. It's a way of letting you know they're after you, they're on you, and they control you. And I've had incidents in my own life that are similar. So it's interesting. He also then, after that wife died, he got involved with, it just amazes me. Here's a guy. And let's also understand that when you have 20 million, let's use that as a rounded number, listeners, you are making a lot of money. Now, George Noory makes $500,000 a year, and he only has a few 100,000 listeners that they have now. He must have been making at least a few $1,000,000 a year, and he is stated online to be worth $10 million, which isn't a lot, but considering the kind of exposure he had, he should have been making a lot more money. But he must have been paid quite a lot of money when he was very popular at his peak. I don't know how long it took him to get to that, but when the show kicked off, I'm assuming he was making a few $1,000,000 a year. So it's not like there's no money in any of this and that they're doing it for just fun. And then it becomes the fact is, oh my God, I can't give this up because I'm making a fortune. So apparently, through internet dating, he met some Filipino girl and got in contact with her, and they eventually got married, and he had problems initially getting her her quote green card, which they give to anybody who shows up now, and even have lotteries they advertise all over the world. But apparently this was a problem, and of course as the great immigration is in America, well, you can run across the board with millions of criminals carrying automatic weapons and driving a tank, and nobody stops you. If you go through the right procedures, there's all sorts of hassles. So he was hassled, and she was even denied entry back into the United States, and all the things that happened. But eventually, of course, I don't know how it could not be with all his money, because the whole immigration thing is such a joke. They want you to prove that your relationship is not fraudulent. And having a foreign wife, again, I know what the process of that's doing. So I'm not talking from third hand, just like I've been on talk shows. I investigated houses. I've been interviewed by the BBC, by CNN. So I'm not talking from, oh, I don't know nothing. This is third hand. So the whole idea is that they gave him information, actually denied her status at that time. But if that was, again, under false pretenses, of course, and what they want you to do is refile again, spend all sorts of money on attorneys. That's all part of the game. But he was able, of course, with all his money and legal intervention, was able to solve that problem, and it didn't become a problem. And the rest is his personal histories of ending the show because of illness and personal problems, and living in apparently the Philippines for a long period of time, which he again now regrets. Not sure why, but if you can live anywhere, why would you live there? But of course her family was from there, so it kind of makes sense that you would go where your wife can be with her family, particularly since he doesn't have any family. He was married a few times, all the other things, whatever all that means. But to get back to what was happening with him in general, is he's like every other person in the media, every ghost hunter, every metaphysical show producer, every so-called media person. They are not part of that industry. Now, in general, people used to get talk shows and do things because they were experts in that particular area. So if you were a person, we've seen car shows, they have car mechanics on there. Well, my car's pounding out this weird sound when I tap it on the side. Well, that's your carburetor. You didn't get an untrained person to do that. They had car mechanics. So generally you get stuff like that. They've had financial advisors on the radio for years and years. They've had psychiatrists on the radio for years. So it goes on and on that experts are there. But when it comes to all this area, like with anything else, and it is a little difficult because, other than the Guild, there is no occult scientist organization that trains people. So where do you go? But there are plenty of noted authors that have huge interests that they could have interviewed or even assisted and brought in that could speak well. I guess Whitley Strieber was one of them who speaks fairly well and can field questions very well. I don't know if everybody can do that. But there's certainly, if they would have hunted enough, they could have found somebody out there that did that other than just, here, you go find people. And that's pretty much as it is. And you can see the kind of screening they do. They're not interested in screening you. They'll bring on most anybody to fill their hours, depending on their popularity. I'm assuming that wasn't a problem in the later years when he was the big shot. But there certainly isn't any great degree. And, the more you're connected, the more you have out there, which you'll see with shows like Nori, the more corporate whores they are, and the people getting on those shows are people that have publicists that get them on the show. And the more connected you are to a publicist, the more you can pretty much guarantee you're going to get on that show. And whether there are kickbacks or other things, I certainly would, I can pretty much guarantee that happens as well. So as we can see here, Art Bell has no background, has no area of that. He obviously had some sort of interest and found some of these areas. I'd like to know what started his doing this on Fridays. And then it became something that his ratings started to shoot up on Fridays because everybody wanted to hear the metaphysical stuff instead of the regular political boredom that was bantered about for hours and hours at nighttime that nobody, I don't think, ultimately cares about. But this didn't, one of my problems is that these people don't go on past that and do things. He really hasn't written any serious books. He hasn't started any institutions or research groups or supports anybody that assists their belief system in this. This is just a job, and the job happens to be this dreamland, talk about funny stuff because it fills my pockets to the brim. And if it wasn't an interest, well, it gets you interested. Guys in particular get involved in activities and have interest because their girlfriend has that interest, so all of a sudden they're interested in it. So, if it's connected to money or sex, you'll develop an interest in it because there's the payoff there. So, as of this time now, Art is coming back. He has a new show, and as I mentioned, I've been invited on it, which I'm not interested in doing, but he is trying to redo this now at he's 70, and I guess he's able to handle it. 3 hours a night isn't exactly that difficult. You have your producers. They set up all the interviews. He shows up. You're on the air, sir, in 5 minutes. Well, he doesn't even do that anymore. That's what producers do. Producers will tell you, well, you'll talk to Art and be on the air in 5 minutes, and that's it. It's not too difficult. He shows up and say, well, who is this? Oh, okay. I don't know if they have anything written or not, but you got to remember they're not interested in reading ahead of time or researching the subject matter like they do in a lot of talk shows and other things. And of course, there seems to be so many people that are over-prepared in talk shows that are on TV. I wonder if that's necessary either. You should be inquisitive. But, they have all sorts of questions written out for them and things they're going to do, etc., etc. And so it's not exactly all that difficult. It's not like he's going to research that particular area of interest that guest is going to speak about. And surprisingly, many of these hosts, whether they are on radio or on TV, rarely read the book of the guest that is coming on, which I would think would be even insulting. But maybe you don't have enough time. If you got 6 guests a week that have books on your show, well, reading 6 books a week probably is very difficult for somebody to do. So it may not be practical to do all that. So And on a show like ours, everybody on there is going to have written a book. And if you have 3 people a night, I mean, you can't read all those books. It's very difficult in general. So they're there to get a synopsis, have questions written, maybe have he's been doing this long enough that he has a vague understanding of the subject matter. And, you're supposed to be questioning. If somebody makes an outrageous statement or says something, well, what is that about? Well, I don't know if he ever questions that or not, but... And then, of course, if you have enough listenership, you're not that involved. Let's open the phones. I got this question. I'm Sam from Idaho. I got a potato here, and I need some help. So the point is that there's not much work you have to do, and if you're any kind of inquisitive or sharp-minded or fast-witted person, which is not really how most people on these talk shows seem to be, you get those more on Drive Time and other shows, which seem to me would be better at these, but you can handle that and steer the people, and then the audience takes it from there. And if you have enough of an audience, you really don't have to talk much at all. And if the questions aren't good or there's a problem, well, thank you for your call, sir. Click. Next. You're on the air. So you go on and on and on until you generate a good show, usually from the questions answered by others, and hopefully by your guest who is responding in an interesting way on an interesting subject. Occultism, which is rarely thought about, even in those days, even on a odd Friday night show, was there was enough people to generate 5 hours worth of talk there, and he was more than happy to keep me on there, not necessarily because he liked me or knew the subject matter, is that there was enough calls coming in to make a decent show, and he didn't have to do any work. So if he had any notes or other subjects, which I'm sure they do, well, if this guy's an idiot, what do? Well, we have to talk about this. Well, he could save all that for the next potential idiot. It's a business, people, like everything. People think somehow writers and show business. If you ever watch Saturday Night Live, you can show how little it takes to put on a show and what poor quality it really is. And these writers, some writers there, are paid millions, like Tina Fey was for years as the head writer there, and produced some of the garbage stuff in the world. So it's not anything special, and you got a bunch of people talking a lot of shit all the time that come up with some really bad skit. And then somebody has to say, well, they're going to take this skit over the other. And what's amazing is that on Saturday Night Live is that the skits they put on there are the best they had compared to bad other ones. Whoa. Hard to believe. But that's just a demonstration for everybody to understand it's a business. And it's not as hard as people think it is. You don't know that world and you think, well, these are special. They've read a whole bunch of books before you got on there. They know the subject matter. Oh, they're special in some way. Well, they're not special in some way. And the only person that has a vast amount of information as eclectically out there about metaphysics and alternative science that I know of is myself, who I've studied it for over 30 years. Technically 45 years I've been studying it, because I've been studying these things since I was very young. And in an eclectic manner. Most people don't do that. Most people say, oh, well, I'm British, so I'm still studying Celtic magic. Or like everybody else does. Well, you're black, so you're going to be going to voodoo. You're going to go into hoodoo. And, that's all you know. Well, it certainly doesn't make you an occult scientist. That makes you a person who has studied in one particular area. And basically, I consider that foolish, stupid, and depowering. So you're certainly not going to find that in some radio host, some child of 2 Marines who basically his only experience was in the military and then some sort of radio thing he was able to get into. But I mean, there's no background here whatsoever, and there's no mention that he had any interest in this. And usually what you get, like you get with the ghost shows, is it becomes some contrived thing that they had all these metaphysical experiences, and they saw ghosts when they were babies rising out of their cribs. And, they're all pretty bad stories. And, of course, they don't want to detail them because they don't make much sense. And then they even state incorrectly what's going on, which is really staggering in general. And the more research you do, the more contrived liars and frauds you find, because they're seeking profits. So, in general, people liked Art Bell. I never disliked him. I never really liked him. I didn't like, in his popular years, I rarely listened to him. I had transitioned out of working those kind of shifts in general, but there was nothing there. It became very, someone makes a statement, and since you know nothing about that field, it goes unchallenged, unanswered. Okay, sir, your next question. So you never got any in-depth thing there, and I guess if you were really ignorant about a subject and relatively open-minded, you found that type of discussions interesting. It became very boring, and I knew lots of the people there, and then, when you get goofball psychotic killers like Ed Dames, the ex-military guy who saw spooks behind, I should say, evil aliens behind every rock, then things get to be a little bit ridiculous when you can't challenge people. But, he didn't want to challenge them. He wanted to put on a show and just leave it out there. But I think that makes very bad radio in general. People just make statements. Ed Dames came on and said that the whole earth was going to be defoliated, that the extraterrestrials were going to drop these things. Now, why they would possibly do that makes no sense whatsoever. This whole military idiocy of thinking needs to be, anybody who is anyway connected to the military or into any type of governmental or law enforcement should be, anything they say should be taken, written on toilet paper, used to wipe your ass, and flushed. Other than that, it has great value. So, So this is the problem with these type of shows. They come to a point where they serve the disinformational background, where people are put on, they're shown to be buffoon idiots and liars and jokes. And what that does is that they discredit the entire area. And as much as people may think that this kind of information isn't liked to be propagated out there, it really is, because the disinformation people love these people to come out and show themselves for the fools they are. They then pop up and say, see what a jerk this guy is, and they've credited the entire field of study just by actually doing that. So that's the disservice that these things start to generate when you have hosts and people who are not qualified in those areas, like George Noory, who there's an audio on him in general, whose background history is pathetic at best, and who has direct military and law enforcement connections. It's again interesting that Bell should have, again, military background as well, but it's pretty common, because with all the wars that America loves to get into and fight to keep their economy going, I guess it's not overly surprising, since America is in a war, has been in a war every 10 years it's been in existence from the day that it declared independence. People forget that the World War II ended in 1945. Korea started in 1955. Vietnam started in 1965. Can we go on? So, it goes on and on with these things, so I guess having people with that, but it also shows, whom they're influenced by and what the reality is. And, but you have to understand what is business, what is entertainment, what does a radio, and what is Art Bell going to do. I don't know how his ratings were before that, but he's a talk show host, so he's going to do what's popular and make some money. And the reason why he did and expanded his show from the Fridays, because it was new. Political talk shows were a dime a dozen when he was on there. They weren't very interesting. They were there. I'm sure his ratings were stagnant at best. And of course, at that time when there wasn't internets and people used radios, you had a certain amount of listeners. But when he did this show, all of a sudden he had affiliates all over the country and had millions and millions of additional listeners. And so all of a sudden, something that may have been a passing fancy or just a whim, all of a sudden is big, important business, just like all these people that are doing shows on ghost shows and everything else now and these other metaphysical shows. It's a business. They're not there doing serious research. They have to make an entertaining show to produce ratings, and that's their number one job. And when that's your number one job, your credibility and what you are teaching in the bigger picture of should this have value past a 10-second masturbatory fantasy reality of you feel good and it's gone, never happens. That's how everything in life is. Boom, 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 it's done now. Was that fun? Yeah, it was fun. What was it about? I don't remember. But, he fills his pockets, he makes millions, and that's how the industry works. And if you don't get the ratings by having interesting shows and you make them too technical, then you lose audience. Now, I don't think that's entirely true either. That's how the media thinks. I think you can put out quality information and quality shows and still make money. Now, whether you can make 10 million instead of 5 million, well, I think I'd prefer to make 5 million and have a credible, good show than make 10 millions and have shit. But I'm probably in the minority there. That's not how Hollywood works. They'll feed you whatever it is, and of course they know better. And they will contrive every possible detail they have and tell you it's true. Now, in a talk show like this, it's about putting a bunch of people on and letting them talk, and I guess, that's their problem. If Ed Dames wants to say all this nonsense and cause problems, and you have 22 million people that listen to it, well, there's a certain responsibility for that, I guess. But, as a commentator, that's not your problem. You're letting Ed Dames, you're letting the diarrhea flow out of his mouth to the public, and it's up to the public whether they flush it or whether they digest it. So, that's always the reverse things when you're a person presenting. And, of course, in the past, the Guild used to present things as informational bases. We don't do that anymore because it doesn't have any value, and we think it misleads people because there is a certain amount of credibility you give to anything by saying, here it is. Well, you want me to look at this? Well, that means it's good, doesn't it? Well, no, it doesn't mean it's good. It's just information to think about. And, you want me to read this because it's good? Well, it's just information. It's someone's opinion. Yeah, but it's good because you're telling me to read it. Well, this is the conundrum, the problems you run into, the conflict with if you recommend anything outside of what you've written or produced as an organization. But you can't write and produce everything as an organization, so recommending things for informational, interesting purposes, something that may have value, is something that any credible organization should do. But you get into problems doing that. So that's what all media is, and of course that's what the entire show is. So at least he put people on. At least he got a lot of people talking and brought out a lot of information people would never know, got it out to millions and millions of people, and you have to give him credit for that. But you also have to understand that there's no screening going on here. There's no information. He is serving as a channel of information to whoever he feels like letting on the air, whatever publicist approaches him, whatever buck he gets for doing it. So it's a complicated mishmash of what's out there, but ultimately, like everything else in life, it has to be buyer beware. Because it's on the Art Bell Show does not mean that there's anything to it whatsoever. It just means that he's presented this person for good or bad, and you ultimately have the responsibility whether you believe it or not. But the problem is when you put somebody on a show like that I've just mentioned, they're given credibility by, well, if they didn't know something, If the book wasn't valid, every word of it, well, you wouldn't put him on the show. And I just covered how that is not really true. So we'll see what happens with the new Art Bell show and how long he stays with it. Being at 70, I don't know, but it isn't exactly hard work, and the producers connect everybody. You just show up. So you think you'd be able to do that almost to the day you drop dead. He complained that he quit before because of back problems. I think he made a lot of excuses of why he quit. I think he quit because he had a lot of money, and it was just easier in life to take care of what he had. He had a wife that died. He had his parents had died not too much earlier before all these things, or in the last 10 years. So, I mean, it was, a time when you have the money to sit back and do whatever Art Bell does on his free time with a pile of money next to him. So time will tell where all this goes, and unfortunately, knowledge doesn't, or information has no value whatsoever if you don't have someone who can challenge it, talk about it, and intelligent, give people credit where they should be given credit, and condemn them when it's just outrageous nonsense. And he had a lot of those people on. But, as I said, in the end, you're supposed to call up and do that for him. He doesn't necessarily see that as his job. So with that, my continuing media audios will be coming, and there's lots of fascinating new areas to cover with the recent explosion in metaphysical documentaries.